So, how does a handful of colonies really just cling to the edge of a vast continent become a global superpower? Today, we're diving into the history of the United States. And let me tell you, it's not a story of peaceful, steady progress. It's the story of a nation forged in a relentless series of conflicts.
You hear this phrase thrown around a lot. From its incredible human accomplishments to its unbelievably powerful military, the United States has often been called a modern Roman empire. It's a really heavy title for sure, but it kind of captures the sheer scale of its influence on the world stage.
That's the real question, isn't it? And it's one that takes us back centuries, to a time before the United States even existed. The answer? Well, it's not some simple, clean story. It's a story of constant and often violent transformation.
Okay, so our story begins not with a founding, but with a collision, a massive one. Before any European flag was ever planted here, North America was a continent humming with deep-rooted civilizations. The arrival of outsiders kicked off a chaotic and frankly brutal competition for the land itself.
I mean, just look at this contrast. It's absolutely staggering. On one side, you've got thousands of years of complex societies with their own governments and cultures, and on the other, you have European powers showing up looking for commerce and conquest. This was not an empty continent, it was a contested one. And that first contact, it brought not just trade, but devastating disease and warfare that would reshape the Americas forever.
The first attempts by Europeans to settle here permanently were just brutal, and so often ended in failure. For every story of survival, like Jamestown or Plymouth, you've got a chilling mystery like Roanoke, where an entire colony just vanished. Back then, survival was absolutely the exception, not the rule. And then, just 12 years after Jamestown was founded, a single event happened that would define the central conflict of this new nation for the next 250 years. The arrival of the first enslaved Africans in 1619 embedded the institution of slavery deep into the foundation of the colonial economy and society. So, as the colonies grew, their identity started to change. But you have to remember, they were still British subjects, loyal to a king thousands of miles away. Well, that loyalty was about to be tested in a big way, leading us right into the next great conflict, the struggle for independence. This wasn't just one thing that happened. It was a rapid escalation, a real snowball effect. Each new act from Parliament felt like a direct violation of the colonists' rights as British citizens. So the crucial point is, it wasn't just about the money. It was about the principle of being taxed without any representation. This steady drumbeat of taxes, protests, and punishments just kept building and building, making a collision totally inevitable. When those first shots were fired at Lexington, most colonists weren't thinking about starting a new country. Not at all. They were fighting for their rights within the British Empire. It really began as a rebellion, a sort of violent demand for respect from their mother country. But this document, this changed everything. The Declaration of Independence, with its absolutely radical ideas about equality and rights that no one can take away, it transformed that rebellion into a full-blown revolution. The goal was no longer to fix the old system, it was to build an entirely new one, a sovereign nation. Okay, so winning the war was one thing, but governing themselves? That was a completely different beast. The newly independent states were more like a loose club than a unified country, and they almost immediately faced a crisis of their own making. Their first shot at a government, the Articles of Confederation, was intentionally designed to be weak. You see, the states were terrified of creating another powerful central authority like the one they had just overthrown. But it was too weak. It led to total economic chaos and even rebellions like Shays' Rebellion, proving that they needed a much stronger framework and fast. And the solution they came up with was the Constitution. It created a federal government with 3 separate branches, each designed to check the power of the others. And this brilliantly illustrates the whole concept of checks and balances. It was a radical experiment in self-governance, really all intended to prevent any one part of the government from becoming too powerful. But that new Constitution had a fatal flaw, a massive one. In order to get all the states to agree, it basically kicked the can down the road on the one issue that truly divided the nation, slavery. This imperfect union set the stage for the country's absolute most devastating conflict. For decades, politicians tried to patch things up with these fragile compromises. But really, each deal just delayed the inevitable and usually made tensions even worse. It led to open violence in places like Bleeding Kansas and radical acts like John Brown's raid. You could just feel the nation tearing itself apart. The final straw was the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. Now, even though he initially promised not to end slavery where it already existed, his opposition to it spreading any further was seen as a major threat by the southern states.
South Carolina seceded, and that house divided began to fall. The American Civil War that came next was just catastrophic. Over 600,000 lives were lost in 4 years of unbelievably brutal fighting. That's a staggering price to pay to decide whether the United States would survive as one nation or split in two over the institution of slavery.
Well, the war did preserve the Union, and it ended slavery, but the nation that came out of it was profoundly changed. And here's the thing, resolving one massive conflict immediately set the stage for new struggles over freedom, identity, and that huge continent that still lay to the west. The outcome of the Civil War was nothing short of revolutionary. I mean, not only was the Union saved, but 3 constitutional amendments totally redefined what it meant to be an American. For the very first time, the Constitution promised freedom, citizenship, and voting rights to all men, regardless of their race.
The period right after the war, which we call Reconstruction, was this incredibly bold attempt to make those promises a reality. But sadly, it was short-lived. A political compromise in 1877 led to federal troops being pulled out of the South, basically abandoning the whole project and leaving the fight for true civil rights unresolved for almost another 100 years.
With the country back together, the national focus shifted, and it shifted dramatically westward. This was all fueled by this idea of manifest destiny, the belief that the U.S. was basically destined to expand across the whole continent, and it was made possible by new tech, like the Transcontinental Railroad. It sparked one final, massive wave of expansion.
So what was pulling all these people west? Well, it was a mix of really powerful motivations. Some people were chasing gold, others wanted land for farming and ranching, and then you had groups like the Mormons who were looking for a place to practice their religion freely. This was a true mass migration that would finally complete the continental footprint of the United States.
And that right there brings us back to the core theme of this entire story. From that first clash of cultures to the Civil War and then westward expansion, the United States wasn't born from some single peaceful moment. It was hammered into shape by conflict, by debate, and by struggle.
By the end of the 19th century, the nation was finally whole, stretching from sea to shining sea. But, as we've seen, the end of one era of conflict only raises new questions. As America walked into the 20th century, it now had to decide what kind of power it was going to be on the world stage, setting up a whole new century of challenges.